You know, it's so funny. There's such a parallel between what Chris Cuomo and what Andrew Cuomo were brought down for, and then in my mind, what they should have been brought down for. So in the case of Andrew Cuomo, you know, he had overseen basically a disastrous COVID policy when it came to New Yorkers most vulnerable. He wrote this edict in March where he forced nursing homes to take back COVID positive patients. And that edict was applicable for 2 months, during which time 6,000 COVID positive seniors were sent back to nursing homes where they spread the virus like wildfire, and 15,000 seniors were killed. And who knows how many of them would have survived if they hadn't been sent back into that environment. And he did the same thing to the developmentally disabled, 552 of whom died of the virus. Now, that was a huge scandal. And when it came to light, it also came out that Andrew Cuomo had done a lot to cover it up. But this didn't get him ousted from his role as governor. It wasn't until it came out that he had sexually harassed his colleagues that suddenly, you know, the blood was out for Andrew Cuomo. And of course, sexual harassment is very, very bad. I'm not trying to minimize it, but I think that there's a real sickness in a society that says that sexual harassment is a worse crime than signing the death warrants of the most vulnerable people who cannot advocate on their own behalf. And I have to say that when it comes to Chris Cuomo, there's totally the same thing happened, right? You know, throughout the COVID pandemic, he did not cover his brother's scandals. He did not cover the senior deaths. Instead, what he did was he was, you know, back channeling, helping his brother, using his journalistic network in order to help him fight sexual harassment claims. Okay, so when that came out, CNN suspended him, but they didn't fire him until he had his own sexual harassment allegation that's over 10 years old from when he was working at a different network. So what CNN essentially did was it took this opportunity for real soul searching and turned it into a story of, yes, I'm going to say it, Me Too overreach.
What does it say about us, about our government, that it can't? This isn't even really a matter of them providing something. They could just get out of the way and let people who make these tests give them to people. It would probably drive the cost down. What do you make of it?
Robbie, I don't know why you're complaining so much. Didn't you hear Jen Psaki say that through her Byzantine complicated plan, 150 million Americans out of 330 million Americans can get tests reimbursed by their insurance company? I really don't understand what the concern is here.
Right,
Look, obviously I'm being...
You have to go to a Dropbox and you'll get a test shipped to you sometime in 6 to 8 months. Yeah. And then you just have to refund. Then they'll send you what government has to make. I mean, this is part of my ideology, but government makes everything so complicated and so difficult.
Well, here's the thing. It doesn't have to. And government is not a monolith. The reality is that per the reporter in that exchange, other countries' governments that are able to avoid that Byzantine process because they're not co-opted by neoliberalism. The problem here isn't the idea of big government. It's the idea that our government is so overly invested in the idea of health insurance subsidies and private-public partnerships that it's not able to do what government is able to do best, which is lower the cost of products like this and distribute them directly to Americans. That's what's being done in other countries, and that's what was being demanded or offered up by the reporter as an alternative to the complicated Byzantine jump on one foot while citing the Pledge of Allegiance approach to this that's being taken currently.
And it's also not the case that inside the United States we don't know how to do this. So like last year, I lived in Vermont, which is part of the United States, even though it resisted becoming so in the very beginning. And if you wanted a COVID test, you either made an appointment at a nearby in Vermont is like 40 minutes away at a nearby testing facility, or you just showed up and then you got in a separate line and it was free, and they would email you your results. They would say within like 2 days, usually came within like a day. No paperwork required other than just filling out something online so they know who you are. It doesn't need to be as complicated as our kludgy system makes it. And on the matter of how to pay for the tests, Stephen Semler made this point on Twitter. He said, Jen Psaki asked, how do you pay for that regarding COVID-19 tests a week after advocating for the Build Back Better Act, which has a $285 billion tax cut for millionaires. And even setting that aside, it was initially a $3.5 trillion piece of legislation that's now down to $1.9 trillion. We don't lack the ability, and people talk about this in terms of dollars. We print our own dollars. The question is, can we produce tests and mail them to people if people need them. Like, you could just take money completely out of it. Do we have, as an economy, the capacity to produce tests and get them in people's hands? Brianna, what is it about the U.S. government that just gets in the way of that?
What it feels like in the case of so many things with COVID is an inability to disentangle oneself, or a lack of interest in disentangling oneself from the private insurance industry. So to talk about costs, the current plan is to have people's costs reimbursed through their insurance company, which, if everyone were insured, would be the same thing as paying for them, the government paying for them outright, right? What's the difference?
Yeah.
The difference is you have the middleman of this corporate entity. Moreover, you exclude everybody who isn't already insured, the most vulnerable members of our population already. That is what neoliberalism has wrought. That is this convoluted thinking that undermines our government's ability to do what it really should be handling best. And to your point, Ryan, there are these photographs famously of people in other countries in Europe using American tests that are marked at a lower rate than they're sold for here in our drugstores. I mean, I went with my mother before Thanksgiving to the CVS to buy a big stack of tests so that as family members trickled in over the course of the holiday week, we could all get tested. And I've spent $150 out of pocket buying these tests just so our family dinner could sit down and eat a meal. And we are lucky enough to be able to afford that kind of expense. But people who flippantly roll their eyes at the idea of bulk buying these $7, $12 tests are really out of touch. And there's been a lot of talk about elitism thrown around by critics of liberals right now, but it's an open field here. Neither party is being sufficiently attentive to the fact that these are huge expenses put on a population that's still very much suffering from not only the economic consequences of the COVID pandemic, but which were in a crisis beforehand, where half of Americans almost couldn't afford a $400 crisis. Now we're being asked to sign up for these crises day after day after day with little to no help from the government.
Let's say they succeed in overturning Roe v. Wade. Will the next phase be to start criminalizing traveling to California or to another state to have an abortion?
Well, and I think that's what's coming what's coming next in the future of this is battles between state laws. And so, yeah, I think that's absolutely possible that if you have states that are creating, because if Roe is overturned, what happens, and we've already seen states doing this, they're essentially creating legislation that would leave abortion legal in the state or protect abortion in all of these different ways, or the opposite if Roe is overturned. And so they're already preparing for this. But what's going to happen is that if you do have states that become sanctuaries, you may actually then see efforts to prevent people from using them as sanctuaries. Kim, what do you think about California, the sort of debate about this in California in particular?
Well, what I think what's really interesting about this entire debate really is how actually in line a lot of people are on both sides of the aisle on this. And this is something that I've been saying for I'm a very staunch pro-choice person. I'm probably one of the more extreme on this case, in this topic, but I have always recognized that this is not actually a partisan issue, that there are a lot of Democrats, a lot of liberals who do not agree with abortion. They feel like it needs to be limited to first term only. There aren't very many people who want to actually eradicate it completely. But there are a lot of Democrats, I would say, that wouldn't mind limiting it down, kind of chipping away at Roe v. Wade right now, which allows it all the way through the first and second term, but to limit it down to that first term. I know they're not really doing it on a term basis, but in general. So, the battle is interesting. And I think, especially when you've got a state like California, you have a lot of Latino voters, and Latinos tend to be very pro-life. But they're also Democrat often. So, it's a really interesting dynamic that's going on with this. As far as the state battle, though, I think that would be really interesting if some states tried to make it illegal for a person to travel to another state in order to obtain an abortion. I don't know how they would get away with that and still call the United States a federation. Yeah. It seems like, then at that point, you just have to be your own country. I mean, can you go to California and smoke pot? I'm pretty sure you can. If you're allowed to come here and smoke pot, they're not going to, the home state of Idaho, where I'm from, where it's illegal, is not going to arrest me if I smoke some weed in California and then travel home to Idaho. So how would they do that is really, obviously before with gay marriage, they didn't recognize the marriage if it happened in a different state. But that's different than saying it's illegal for you to have done it.